Is another example where I think there's just this tendency, this instinctive knee-jerk desire to water Nietzsche down, to not take him seriously, to not believe him. And I think it's a mistake. And I think the importance of starting with Nietzsche's strangeness, with his madness, is to encourage us to take him seriously for once, to not try to water him down, to believe him when he tells us something. I've read a lot of people who've written about Friedrich Nietzsche, and I've come across so many different interpretations of Nietzsche's writing. And even on this channel, I've expressed the variety of perspectives I've been aware of and I've thought about, and the way in which Nietzsche has always held this sort of enigmatic position to me, where I didn't really know how to feel about him. So over the past few months, I've tried to rectify that by doing a deep dive into Nietzsche's writing, specifically his books, his works, and not any of the secondhand literature, to really come up with my own conclusions. Of course, Nietzsche is the darling of a lot of dude bro male YouTubers. If you click on one Nietzsche YouTube video, you get recommended like an endless rabbit hole of Nietzsche YouTube. And it's not really a mystery why. I mean, he's very transgressive. He's very masculine. He believes in like these hard male virtues of courage and power. And his politics sort of speak to our modern day culture wars. He is anti-egalitarian. He is anti-women's suffrage. He is anti-democratic. He is pro-hierarchy. And so the question for me has been, what do we do with this? What do we make of the man? Is there anything that should be salvaged or can be salvaged? Or what was his brilliance? So I want to start this discussion at a place that I have not really seen addressed anywhere else. If it's addressed to dismiss Nietzsche. But from my perspective, no matter what we do with Nietzsche, whether or not we accept him or try to learn from him or choose to reject him, any serious discussion of Nietzsche needs to start with his madness. It's well known that Nietzsche experienced like a total mental breakdown and collapse at the age of 44, and he lived in the state of derangement for the rest of his life. But that's not really what I'm talking about. In Nietzsche's writing, for those who actually take the time to read it, can be found a level of self-confidence and a level of grandiosity and megalomania and egotism, which is really shocking. So what am I talking about? So let's start by taking a look at the preface to Friedrich Nietzsche's book, The Antichrist. This is one of his later works. It deals with the character of Jesus, and it deals with Friedrich Nietzsche's understanding of Jesus and religion in general. It's written in his sort of regular style. It's aphoristic. It has these very short chapters, as you can see. Personally, I'm not such a big fan of Nietzsche's writing, but that's just me. Most people who read him are big fans of his writing, apparently. But let's just look at the preface here. Okay, this is Friedrich Nietzsche's introduction to his Antichrist, a book about Christianity, a book about faith, a book about Jesus, a book about the way in which morality corrupts mankind. Quote, "This book belongs to the most rare of men. Perhaps not one of them is yet alive. It is possible that they may be among those who understand my Zarathustra. Some men are born posthumously." This is the kind of egotism and grandiosity and elitism which is pervasive in Friedrich Nietzsche's writing. And there's this big question of what do we do with this? Because that doesn't sound realistic, okay? It doesn't sound realistic that perhaps not one of them is yet alive who can appreciate this book. And so different readers will do different things with this. It's possible that this is his marketing program. This is how he advertises himself and makes himself sound so good. He makes his reader feel good. If you like this book, you're such a special, unique person. The other element is that Nietzsche's whole worldview and thinking is shot through with this incredible contempt, right? Of what account are the rest, Nietzsche asks, meaning the readers who don't appreciate him. The rest are mere humanity. One must make oneself superior to humanity in power, in loftiness of soul, in contempt. End quote. This is Nietzsche. And to my ears, there's a madness here. Okay? There's a madness here. And among all the dude bros who make YouTube videos about Nietzsche, I don't think there's a sufficient reckoning with this kind of a madness. This is Nietzsche's autobiography, Ecce Homo, okay? Let's look at some of the chapter titles. Why I Am So Wise. Why I Am So Clever. Why I Write Such Excellent Books. We can write this off as like a flourish of his eccentric style. We can write this off as like community building of, again, trying to make the reader feel good about himself. But I don't think that's right. I think there's something important here which we should have the courage to look at. It doesn't mean we need to write him off. It doesn't mean we need to reject him or say he's not worth reading or not worth thinking about. But there's something we need to acknowledge about this man. This attitude of self-congratulation reaches its pinnacle when Nietzsche writes about this book right here, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. When Nietzsche describes and talks about this book, he talks about it in the most reverent tones imaginable. And let's just speak for a minute about Thus Spoke Zarathustra. I mean, this is a difficult, weird book. Again, I'm not such a fan of Nietzsche's writing, so for me it's extra hard. But if you listen to any of these YouTubers who give you instructions about how to read Nietzsche, they all say, don't start with Thus Spoke Zarathustra. You won't understand it. And my reaction to that is, after reading the rest of his works, after reading The Joyful Wisdom, also known as The Gay Science, after reading Beyond Good and Evil and The Genealogy of Morals and The Antichrist, does Thus Spoke Zarathustra really get easier? I don't know. It's such a weird book. To summarize, it's like the account of this prophet, Zarathustra, who comes down from a mountaintop, sort of oversaturated, overladen with wisdom. And he comes down to the townfolk and the people in the city, and he pronounces to them, he exclaims this message of the Superman and this idea that man is something to be overcome. And the book is him basically speaking aphoristically to people, meeting them in different settings, and looking for the Superman and failing to find the Superman. He develops some acolytes, some sort of students who follow him, and there's maybe a hope at some point that these will be the Supermen, but they're not the Supermen. And the book ends. It's a weird book. And let's look how Nietzsche describes this book. In my life work, my Zarathustra holds a place apart. With it, I gave my fellow men the greatest gift that has ever been bestowed upon them. This book, the voice of which speaks out across the ages, is not only the loftiest book on earth, literally the book of mountain air. The whole phenomenon, mankind, lies at an incalculable distance beneath it. But it is also the deepest book, born of the inmost abundance of truth, an inexhaustible well into which no pitcher can be lowered without coming up again laden with gold and with goodness. He goes on like this for a while. We're going to skip ahead now. Nietzsche writes, in order to understand even a little of my Zarathustra, perhaps a man must be situated and constituted very much as I am myself, with 1 foot beyond the realm of the living. End quote, right? And this is how Nietzsche sees himself. This is his self-perception. Nietzsche sees himself as having 1 foot beyond the realm of the living. Again, you can minimize this. You can say this is just rhetoric. This is just him self-promoting. This is just him trying to build a community of readers or whatever. But that's not what I see here. And these are not isolated exceptions, incidents. I see someone who really has a kind of a God complex. Skipping, quote, after casting a glance between the pages of my Zarathustra, I pace my room to and fro for half an hour at a time, unable to overcome an insufferable fit of tears. End quote. Okay? This is Nietzsche. You can love him, you can hate him, you can think he's brilliant, you can think he's immoral, illiberal, whatever. But we should just agree with the starting point, that we're dealing with a very unusual mind, a very unusual sense of one's own worth and one's own capacities. Someone who really sees himself as being completely detached and disconnected from the whole of humanity in a profound way. And so for me, if we're going to choose to read Nietzsche and take him seriously and try to understand him and understand his message, it's helpful to think about a template for someone who, on the one hand, we can acknowledge is brilliant and has something interesting and valuable to share. On the other hand, is undeniably kind of mad, kind of unbalanced. And so in his Varieties of Religious Experience, William James writes about the founders of religions. And I see in that a useful template for thinking about a character as strange and difficult and challenging as Nietzsche. And so I want to look at that now. So William James, in this context, is talking about who are these people that are the trendsetters in religion, that are the founders of religion, that are the authors of the religious texts. And he says, quote, "We must make search for the original experiences which were the pattern setters to all this mass of suggested feeling and imitated conduct. These experiences we can only find in individuals for whom religion exists not as a dull habit, but as an acute fever rather. But such individuals are geniuses in the religious line, and like many other geniuses who have brought forth fruits effective enough for commemoration in the pages of biography, such religious geniuses have often shown symptoms of nervous instability. Even more perhaps than other kinds of genius, religious leaders have been subject to abnormal psychical visitations. Invariably, they have been creatures of exalted emotional sensibility. Often they have led a discordant inner life. They have known no measure, been liable to obsessions and fixed ideas, and frequently they have fallen into trances, heard voices, seen visions, and presented all sorts of peculiarities which are ordinarily classed as pathological." End quote. And William James goes on to write that just because these people have had trances or visions, peculiarities which are ordinarily classed as pathological, it doesn't mean we have to ignore these people or reject these people. From William James's perspective, there can be a confluence of a kind of madness, a kind of habit of mind which is unusual, which sees itself as having one foot beyond the realm of the living, as we saw in Nietzsche's own language, sees itself as being fundamentally different. And there can be in that a sensitivity to a different kind of wisdom, a different kind of perspective. Along these lines, fallen into trances, heard voices, seen visions, okay? Nietzsche's own writing, his own testimony attests to this. And I don't think it's possible to understand Zarathustra, to understand Nietzsche, to understand what's going on there without reading and appreciating Nietzsche's own testimony about his trances and his voices and his visions. The way in which Nietzsche, who of course is extremely anti-religious and extremely adamantly, vehemently, militantly atheistic, nevertheless matches this template, embodies this character of the religious prophet. So now we're going to look at this section in Ecce Homo, where Nietzsche describes to us his process, how he wrote Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And this will tell us volumes about Nietzsche, the man, about how he wrote, about how he thought of himself and understood himself, and of course, how he thinks about Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So, quote, "Has anyone at the end of the 19th century any distinct notion of what poets of a stronger age understood by the word inspiration?" End quote, right? He's saying, does anyone today, at the end of the 19th century, know what the poets were talking about when they spoke about inspiration? Continuing, "If not, I will describe it. If one had the smallest vestige of superstition left in one, it would hardly be possible to completely set aside the idea that one is the mere incarnation, mouthpiece, or medium of an almighty power. End quote. Okay, listen to this testimony. Nietzsche is saying, I am an atheist. I have no superstition. I don't believe in God, but I am a prophet. Okay? He says, my experience, this is aligned with what William James was saying about the experience of these religious figures, these prophets. My experience is of being the incarnation, mouthpiece, or medium of an almighty power. Quote, the idea of revelation in the sense that something which profoundly convulses and upsets one becomes suddenly visible and audible with indescribable certainty and accuracy describes the simple fact. One hears, one does not seek, one takes, one does not ask who gives. A thought suddenly flashes up like lightning. It comes with necessity, without faltering. I have never had any choice in the matter. There is an ecstasy so great that the immense strain of it is sometimes relaxed by a flood of tears, during which one's steps now involuntarily rush and anon involuntarily lag. There is a feeling that one is utterly out of hand, with the very distinct consciousness of an endless number of fine thrills and titillations descending to one's very toes. And this goes on, but we'll stop here. Okay? I don't think it's possible to understand Nietzsche without understanding this passage. If you read books about Nietzsche, if you watch the BroTube, YouTube, BookTube videos about Nietzsche, they don't seem to address this. They don't seem to want to talk about this. But this is who Nietzsche was, okay? He was the character described by William James. Returning now to the varieties of religious experience, okay? This describes Nietzsche to a T. This, I think, is important in understanding who we're dealing with. Quote, thus, when a superior intellect and a psychopathic temperament coalesce, as in the endless permutations and combinations of human faculty, they are bound to coalesce often enough in the same individual, we have the best possible condition for the kind of effective genius that gets into the biographical dictionaries. Such men do not remain mere critics and understanders with their intellect. Their ideas possess them. They inflict them, for better or worse, upon their companions of their age. End quote. With that out of the way, let's now take a look at Nietzsche's ideas. So let's talk now about Nietzsche's Superman. This is such a strange and difficult concept for people. Nietzsche clearly saw himself as the Superman. But what the heck is the Superman? If you watch Nietzsche YouTube, I mean, you'll get a sense that the Superman is like David Goggins. The Superman is Wim Hof. It's this hard, courageous, manly man who does all the hard, manly things and takes ice baths and is a motivational speaker and, is a self-help, clean your room kind of guru. But is that a correct reading of Nietzsche? What's, I think, most remarkable is that in all of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and as far as I can tell in all of Nietzsche's writings, there's never any description of how to become a Superman. There's never even a clear description of what the Superman is. So much is left up to interpretation. And so why is that? Why does he not give us any program or any hint or any clue about what we should do to become the Superman? So I'm going to answer that question in a moment. But before I do, let's pull up the opening of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and let's read the way this is introduced. So Zarathustra is coming down from the mountain. He's sort of eager to share his message to the people. So, quote, when Zarathustra came into the next town, which lies on the edge of the forest, he found many people gathered together in the marketplace, for it had been promised that there would be a tightrope walker. And Zarathustra spoke thus to the people, I teach you the Superman. Man is something that shall be overcome. What have you done to overcome him? All beings so far have created something beyond themselves. And do you want to be the ebb of this great flood, and even go back to the beasts rather than overcome man? What is the ape to man? A laughingstock or a painful embarrassment? And man shall be just that for the Superman, a laughingstock or a painful embarrassment. Behold, I teach you the Superman. The Superman is the meaning of the earth. Skipping ahead, where is the lightning to lick you with its tongue? Where is the frenzy with which you should be inoculated? Behold, I teach you the Superman. He is this lightning. He is this frenzy. End quote. And if we connect the dots in Nietzsche's writing, I think it's impossible not to identify the Superman with another Nietzschean concept of amor fati. This reading of mine is not the common reading. It's not a reading that I see other people use. This is not the way I see most people describe the Superman in Nietzsche, but I think it's clearly the correct reading. The Superman is someone who lives very aligned with the way things are. The Superman is someone who is deeply contented and satisfied and fulfilled in their life and in their fate. This concept of amor fati that Nietzsche is famous for is this love of fate, loving what is. And Nietzsche looks around him and he sees a world of politics. He sees a world of commerce, of people striving, of trying to get somewhere. And he says, this is a symptom of modernity. There's something unnatural in this. Nietzsche sees himself as so beyond that, beyond this project of feeling dissatisfied and trying to self-actualize and trying to improve. And this, of course, is the key of why he gives us so little to hold on to. Because the concept of the Superman is completely inimical to self-help. Anyone who is interested in a self-help program, anyone who's interested in doing these 5 things and taking ice baths to toughen up and to become hard and to become courageous and whatever, has completely missed the boat as far as Nietzsche is concerned. The Superman isn't something that can be taught. It has to be found. Because if you're teaching, if you're trying to get there, if you're trying to learn, you are so far from the Superman, it's not even close. And this concept that I'm describing, the way in which I'm reading the Superman, is not such a strange and foreign thing. It's an animalistic way of being in the world. It's a way of being in the world that is not burdened with anxiety or complex planning about the future or ruminating about the past or any sense of moral guilt or any belief in an afterlife or a God. It's a way of being in the world that doesn't even have any contact or concept of free will, because it's a way of being in the world which is so aligned that the sense of self and the sense of agency evaporates. It's non-existent. And of course, this is the way of being in the world that we can identify in the animal kingdom. And indeed, Nietzsche famously writes in this opening section of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, quote, "Man is a rope stretched between the animal and the Superman, a rope over an abyss." End quote, right? So we are in that abyss, the abyss of modernity, the abyss of politics and civil rights and egalitarianism and commerce and trying to make the world better or make our lives better or make ourselves better. And the Superman isn't aware of any of that. The Superman isn't even in contact with something like guilt or free will or regret or anxiety. He's beyond that. I think that Nietzsche wanted to teach this message of the Superman, and he wanted to share it. He saw it as a certain gift, a certain achievement, a certain way of being in the world which was exalted, and he wanted to share it. But he can't give you anything to hold on to. He can't give you any plan or program or steps to get there, because to do that would be the ultimate distortion, would be the ultimate misunderstanding. If you thought that to become the Superman, you had to take long mountain walks in the rarefied air like Nietzsche did for hours at a time or whatever, you would completely be missing the point, because you would confuse this program with the thing. And the thing itself is the no program. The thing itself is the love of fate. And the love of fate accepts everything. The love of fate has no bounds. The love of fate has no concept of trying to get somewhere or improve or become the Superman. And of course, this is like a central paradox. And the way in which this paradox is manifest is in the paradoxical writing and the paradoxical concept of the Superman, and this paradox of this character who's so great and so beyond and gives you so little to hold on to. There's no clarity about what exactly he is or how to get there. Because if you're asking those questions, if you're trying to get there, you've missed the point. You've violated. You've you're completely disconnected from amor fati, from love of fate, from love of what is. You're living in this world of the self, of free will and choice and God and afterlife and the past and the future and anxiety and right and wrong. And Nietzsche is coming to you from a place beyond all those things, beyond right and wrong, beyond good and evil, beyond guilt, beyond progress. It's just a total alignment with what is, no sense of free will. And if that sounds bizarre and if that sounds crazy, I would say yes, Nietzsche is very bizarre. Nietzsche is very crazy. If that sounds like that's impractical or that this is a book that could not be understood by anyone because it's such a strange and foreign idea, I would say yes, Nietzsche has told us that many times, that this is a very strange book, an impractical book, a book for none and all, a book that will not be understood by anyone who reads it, maybe for 100 years. So we've spoken a little bit about the Superman and love of fate in Nietzsche. Let's talk now about another crucial central Nietzschean concept, the eternal return. It's another concept, it's another example where I think there's just this tendency, this instinctive knee-jerk desire to water Nietzsche down, to not take him seriously, to not believe him. And I think it's a mistake. And I think the importance of starting with Nietzsche's strangeness, with his madness, is to encourage us to take him seriously for once, to not try to water him down, to believe him when he tells us something. So now we're looking at The Joyful Wisdom by Friedrich Nietzsche, also known as The Gay Science, another one of these aphoristic texts with all these little chapters. So we get this chapter here, The Heaviest Burden. Quote, "What if a demon crept after thee into thy loneliest loneliness some day or night, and said to thee, this life, as thou livest it at present, and hast lived it, thou must live it once more, and also innumerable times, and there will be nothing new in it, but every pain, and every joy, and every thought, and every sigh, and all the unspeakably small and great in thy life must come to thee again, and all in the same series and sequence. And similarly this spider, and this moonlight among the trees, and similarly this moment, and I myself. The eternal sandglass of existence will ever be turned once more, and thou with it, thou speck of dust. Wouldst thou not throw thyself down and gnash thy teeth, and curse the demon that so spake? Or hast thou once experienced a tremendous moment in which thou wouldst answer him, thou art a god, and never did I hear aught more divine?" End quote. And this is the central question. This is the choice, the two paths, the fork in the road between modern man and the Superman. Love of fate and not love of fate. How do you respond to this demon? How do you respond to this knowledge that life recurs in its minutest detail forever, an infinite number of times, like Sisyphus rolling the boulder, every single time? What do you do with this glimpse of information, this glimpse of insight, where for a moment you see stretching in front of you forever, for infinity, like that room of mirrors, just reflecting back and forth towards infinity, this exact same moment, and behind you, this exact same moment lived an infinite number of times? How do you feel about that? And the normal response is to feel a kind of vertigo, to feel a kind of, whoa, what is that? This is a kind of a trap. I'm stuck. But the Superman, Nietzsche, this love of fate, says this is divine. Nothing could be better. Nothing could be more perfect than this. You are a god. Nietzsche responds. What Nietzsche's describing is so difficult. It's this being nailed to the cross of infinity. An awareness that this moment, this instantaneous moment, has been lived an infinite number of times. It extends forever. There's nothing beyond this. This deep sense of there is nowhere to go. There is nothing beyond this. There is no God. There is no afterlife. There is no free will and choice. There is everything that happened is perfect. Every time you misspoke or embarrassed yourself or did something cringe or did something wrong or did something cruel or whatever, it couldn't be any other way. It's perfection. This idea, of course, comes up in thus spoke Zarathustra as well. And when I made this comparison in the beginning between Nietzsche and the character of the prophet as described by William James, I think we can think about, sort of in broad strokes, what are some of the themes that these prophets, these religious minds, these sort of, we might say, crazy, mad, religious writers with characterized by these visions and this religious ecstasy who impose their ideas upon people. What are some of the themes that animate their work? And one of those themes is the seeing through the illusion of death. I think that comes up again in different religions and in different ways. And Nietzsche, who is the most anti-religious person in the world, has a similar insight. He too sees through the illusion of death. He too sees infinite life and it's the eternal return. A question that comes up again and again is Nietzsche serious about the eternal return? Is it real or is it just a thought experiment? And the implied answer, the answer that I see everywhere in any YouTuber or book that seems to address this question is, of course, it's a thought experiment. There's some agenda associated with it. Like maybe there's some political agenda about, politics, that power structures are inevitable or something like that, or some other kind of psychological benefit in sort of running through this thought experiment in your head. But I would venture, from my perspective, it's obvious to me that this is not a thought experiment for Nietzsche. When you read Thus Spoke Zarathustra, you read the way he talks about his ideas and his writing. This is clearly meant to be taken literally. And I encourage you to just look at this encounter. This is described in Julian Jung's philosophical biography of Nietzsche. An encounter between Nietzsche and a friend of his, a woman named Reza von Schönhofer. And she describes, quote, "As Nietzsche rose to leave, suddenly his manner changed. With a rigid expression in his face, and looking reluctantly all around as though some terrible danger threatened, were anyone to overhear his words, and putting his hand to the mouth in order to dampen the sound, he announced to me the secret which Zarathustra had whispered in life's ear. There was something bizarre, even uncanny, in the way in which he told me of the eternal return, and the enormous weight of this idea." End quote. Okay? There's no question that Nietzsche took this seriously. Nietzsche is not the person to traffic in these kind of frivolous thought experiments for fun. This testimony here, along with just reading his writing, it's obvious to me that he saw something. He glimpsed something, the kind of glimpse that we associate with like the prophets of religion. This just knowledge, this kind of immediate knowledge that this moment is forever. That what we're experiencing extends in front and behind us for infinity. That it can't be any other way. That it's perfect. It's the ultimate expression of love, of fate. And if that sounds weird to you, if that sounds difficult to comprehend or unhelpful, well, I beg you look at the way in which Nietzsche introduces his books to us and says they are not for you. That you will not be able to understand them. Perhaps the person who can understand this is not born yet, Nietzsche says. And he's not joking. And that distinction is that we have this understanding of a self. We believe, whether we say we do or we don't, even if you write a whole long, massive book about you don't believe in free will, we do. We have a sense of free will. We have a sense of self. We have a sense of autonomy and agency and power. We have a sense of volition. We have a sense that things are one way, but they could be different. Things in the past could have been different. In the future might be different. Nietzsche has moved beyond this. Nietzsche does not inhabit that world that we inhabit. And that's what the Superman is. That's what love of fate is. It's this embrace, this infinite embrace, this infinite acceptance. To put it differently, no moment can be elevated over any other moment. Your greatest exaltation is on the same infinite loop playback as your biggest embarrassment. There's no path to wholeness. There's no self-help program. There's no trying to get somewhere. You're already there. You're always as there as you will ever be. There's no escaping this moment. It's always here. It's always perfect. And Nietzsche looks around and he says everyone else is playing this game of good and bad, of better and worse. of this life and next life, of right and wrong. And Nietzsche rejects this. He completely rejects this. Here in Ecce Homo, Nietzsche is talking about himself and talking about what makes him special. Quote, "My formula for greatness in man is amor fati." The fact that a man wishes nothing to be different, either in front of him or behind him, or for all eternity. Not only must the necessary be born, and on no account concealed, it must also be loved. End quote. Who can do that? Who among us can do that? Nietzsche testifies that he can do that. Nietzsche testifies he's the Superman. And he imagines a world in the future, one day, where this is possible. But right now, in our modern world, a world of decadence, our world of nihilism, our world of religion, of good and bad, this is not possible, Nietzsche says. We are over the abyss that separates the animal world from the Superman world. We're in this internal paradox of modernity. A lot is made of Nietzsche's will to power, for example. And among his ideas, this is one of them that sounds quite ugly, that sounds repulsive. It's part of his understanding of social Darwinism and hierarchy. But part of what's going on there, when Nietzsche talks about the will to power, and he says that the powerful nobleman who oppresses his servants and slaves and rules with an iron fist is expressing his will to power, and the religious person who lives a saintly life of self-abnegation and asceticism and moral virtue is expressing his will to power. What Nietzsche's saying is that everything is the will to power and can only be the will to power because it can't be any other way. Anything that happens, anything you do is not good or bad. It's just the will to power. If you insult someone or you're kind to someone or you give charity, you can't escape the fact that you're just doing what has to be done. You're just living out the pinnacle of Darwinian evolution, this human organism, this human animal doing what it has to do, which is a will to power. And there's no value judgment anymore. There's no right or wrong anymore. It just is the way it has to be and the only way it can be. And that's what Nietzsche sees. And that's what no one else sees. Everything is the way it is because it can't be any other way. When we talk about the themes associated with these religious thinkers, these prophets, these people who give birth to religious ideas and religious sects, another major theme that comes up is the theme of suffering, the redemption of suffering. The symbol of Christianity, of course, of Jesus' suffering on the cross is an example of that. And in Nietzsche, we find something very similar. Suffering is something that animates Nietzsche's work. It's well known that Nietzsche suffered all sorts of physical ailments. He suffered from long, drawn-out episodes of vomiting and headaches and migraines. He was bedridden for long stretches of time. So this is a quote, again, from Julian Jung's philosophical biography. This is a letter from Nietzsche to his doctor. Quote, "My existence is a terrible burden. I would have discarded it long ago if it wasn't for the most instructive tests and experiments in the spiritual moral area. Constant pain for several hours a day, with a feeling closely related to seasickness, during which I find it difficult to speak. By way of a change, raging seizures. The last one forced me to vomit for 3 days and nights. I thirsted after death. Can't read. Only seldom can I write. No contact with human beings. Not able to listen to music. All inner means of amelioration useless." End quote. One more example of Nietzsche's experience of suffering. This is a letter to a friend of his. Quote, "This will no doubt be my last letter." Right? Nietzsche's saying there won't be any more letters because he's going to die. Continuing, "For the terrible and unrelenting martyrdoms of my life make me thirst for the end. According to certain symptoms, it seems that the saving brain stroke is close enough to grant me hope." End quote, right? He's saying he's hoping that he is finally near death. That's what he's saying. We continue. As far as torture and deprivation are concerned, my life during the past few years can measure up to that of any ascetic. Nevertheless, and this is important, and this is what we're going to come back to as we go forward. Nevertheless, I have attained much during these same years towards the purifying and polishing of my soul. End quote. Nietzsche's philosophy is born out of suffering. To understand the role that suffering plays in Nietzsche's writing and in his philosophy, we look at his preface to the Gay Science, or the Joyful Wisdom, right? What is the joyful wisdom that he's talking about? What is this reservoir of joy from which his work and his thinking pours forth? Quote, gratitude continually flows forth, as if the most unexpected thing had happened. The gratitude of a convalescent, right? The convalescent means feeling recovered from being sick, the feeling of being better. For convalescence was the most unexpected thing. Joyful wisdom, that implies the saturnalia of a spirit which has patiently withstood a long, frightful pressure, patiently, strenuously, impassionately, without submitting, but without hope, and which is now suddenly overpowered with hope, the hope of health, the intoxication of convalescence. End quote. What Nietzsche is describing here is an intoxication of feeling okay again, being completely overwhelmed with this feeling of recovery. Later on in The Joyful Wisdom, Nietzsche goes further. He begins to talk about the way in which pain is the purifier of the spirit, the way in which pain has polished him, so to speak. He writes, quote, "It is great pain only, which is the ultimate emancipator of the spirit, for it is the teacher of the strong suspicion which makes an X out of every Y." According to the footnote here, making an X out of an every Y means like corrupting the books. But the key thing is that it's a teacher that brings clarity, a true correct X. It is great pain only, the long, slow pain which takes time, by which we are burned, as it were, with green wood. Right? This is, again, the purification process of pain that Nietzsche sees. We're made deeper and hardened and improved by pain. Continuing, that compels us philosophers to descend into our ultimate depths and divest ourselves of all trust, all good nature, veiling gentleness and averageness, wherein we have perhaps formally installed our humanity. Skipping a bit. One emerges from such long, dangerous exercises in self-mastery as another being, with several additional notes of interrogation, and above all, with the will to question more than ever, more profoundly, more strictly, more sternly, more wickedly, more quietly than has ever been questioned hitherto. He concludes, "We know a new happiness." End quote. And this is the secret, I think, to Nietzsche's character. Someone who suffered so tremendously and got to the other side of that suffering, and is bringing this message of redemption, that suffering is redeemed. And there's a light version of this. There's a simple version of this, which says, now I feel better. Now I'm happy. And so I write a joyful book. But that's not what Nietzsche's saying. Nietzsche has seen the full redemption of everything, of including the suffering. The suffering is redeemed. It's not like now I'm fine, then was bad. It's that now I'm fine, and the suffering was fine too. And that's what's so hard to understand. That's what's so inaccessible to most people. That's where that burning of pain and suffering and the sharpening of that pressure plays out. Because for most of us, that's not how it would work. It was, there's bad, then there's good. For Nietzsche, it's different. The good has redeemed everything, even the bad. Another place where this question of suffering, getting through suffering, getting to the other side of suffering, and having that suffering be redeemed retroactively. Another place that plays out is in The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. The character of Ivan in the Brothers Karamazov has a lot in common with Friedrich Nietzsche. We know that Nietzsche read some Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky comes up in Nietzsche's writings. From what I understand, Dostoevsky did not read Nietzsche, but they are very aligned in their thinking, especially this character of Ivan. And in one of the most amazing chapters in the Brothers Karamazov, Ivan is feverish and he's hallucinating and he's visited by the devil. And the devil has a very interesting philosophical discourse with Ivan. And they talk about different ideas. And Ivan is a very Nietzschean character, as I said. He's an atheist. And the devil shares with Ivan a parable. So I'm pulling up here the Brothers Karamazov on Project Gutenberg. And we're going to the chapter Ivan and the Devil. And in this chapter, the devil is sort of tormenting Ivan with his philosophy and telling him these stories. And the devil is now going to share a story to Ivan. He says, quote, "There was, they say, here on earth, a thinker and philosopher. He rejected everything." Okay? So at this point, we know the devil is sort of parodying and sort of making fun of Ivan. Because Ivan is the thinker and the philosopher who rejected everything. So this is a story about Ivan, basically. Laws, conscience, faith, and above all, the future. He died. He expected to go straight to darkness and death, and he found a future life before him. He was astounded and indignant. "This is against my principles," he said, and he was punished for that. "That is, you must excuse me. I am just repeating what I heard myself. It's only a legend." He was sentenced to walk a quadrillion kilometers in the dark. The devil says, we've adopted the metric system, you know. This devil's a very funny character, as you can probably tell already. We continue. "And when he has finished the quadrillion, the gates of heaven would be opened to him, and he'll be forgiven." Ivan, who's feverish and unhappy, "And what tortures have you in the other world besides the quadrillion kilometers?" asked Ivan, with a strange eagerness. "What tortures? Ah, don't ask. In old days we had all sorts, but now they have taken chiefly to moral punishments, the stings of conscience, and all that nonsense. We got that too from you, from the softening of your manners." Yeah, so there's the Nietzschean here disdain for the decadence of modernity, the moral punishments, the stings of conscience. These are things that Nietzsche himself would also disdain and look down upon. Well, this man was condemned to the quadrillion kilometers, stood still, looked round, and lay down across the road. "I won't go. I refuse on principle." "Bravo," cried Ivan, still with the same strange eagerness. Now he was listening with an unexpected curiosity. "Well, is he lying there now?" The devil. "That's the point, that he isn't. He lay there for almost 1,000 years, and then he got up and went on." "What an ass," cried Ivan, laughing nervously, and still seeming to be pondering something intently. "Does it make any difference whether he lies there forever or walks the quadrillion kilometers? It would take 1 billion years to walk it." The devil. "Much more than that. I haven't got a pencil and paper, or I could work it out, but he had got there long ago, and that's where the story begins." "What? He got there? But how did he get the 1 billion years to do it?" The devil. "Why, you keep thinking of our present Earth, but our present Earth may have been repeated 1 billion times. Why, it's become extinct, been frozen, cracked, broken to bits, disintegrated into its elements again, the water above the firmament, then again a comet, again a sun, again from the sun it becomes Earth. And the same sequence may have been repeated endlessly and exactly the same to every detail, most unseemly and insufferably tedious." End quote, right? That is the eternal return. The devil says, yeah, you and your short-minded thinking of, this one experience, this one plan. He says there's an eternal return. These things happen over and over and over again, forever and ever and ever. Ivan, well, what happened when he arrived? Why, the moment the gates of paradise were open and he walked in, before he had been there 2 seconds by his watch. The devil says, though to my thinking his watch must have long dissolved into its elements on the way. He cried out that those 2 seconds were worth walking not a quadrillion kilometers, but a quadrillion of quadrillions raised to the quadrillionth power. End quote. In fact, he sang Hosanna and overdid it so that some persons there of lofty ideas wouldn't shake hands with him at first. End quote. That's the Nietzschean experience. That's the Nietzschean perspective. The quadrillion miles. That's what Nietzsche is coming to write to us about. Those quadrillion miles in the dark. And when you get to the other end and you say it was all worth it, it was all redeemed. Every moment of it was perfect. It couldn't have been and shouldn't have been, and I wouldn't have wanted it any other way. This is the Nietzschean perspective. This is the Nietzschean insight that suffering can be redeemed, and it can be redeemed retroactively. That you might not like it, you might resist it, or think it's bad, it's not accepted, it's not the way it is, but there's a different perspective. It might not be your perspective, but who cares about your perspective, Nietzsche says. From a different perspective, it's perfect. It's completely perfect. It's the way it should be, and it's redeemed. I want to read you a passage now from Thus Spoke Zarathustra. It's from towards the end of the book, and it's one of the most memorable, horrific, graphic, visual images in the book. And I've heard this passage interpreted by different YouTubers, and man, I mean, I'll just, in general, I'm a big believer that, all interpretations are valid and whatever, but some of the interpretations I hear on this story are like so outlandish to me. They're like so beyond silly. But we're going to look at this story now, this little passage now, and we're going to talk about it. In this passage here, Zarathustra is sort of walking, as he does, through the world, and he encounters something horrifying. He encounters something that shocks him and horrifies him and just fills him with terror. So we're told, there lay a man, and there the dog leaping, bristling, whining. Now did it see me coming, and did it howl again, then did it cry. Had I ever heard a dog cry so for help? And verily what I saw, the like had I never seen. A young shepherd did I see, writhing, choking, quivering, with distorted countenance, and with a heavy black serpent hanging out of its mouth. A horrifying image. And we get the sense from what we've read so far and what we're going to read that Zarathustra is panicked. Zarathustra is stricken with fear and horror at what he's seeing. We continue. Had I ever seen so much loathing and pale horror on one countenance? He had perhaps gone to sleep. Then had the serpent crawled into his throat. There had it bitten itself fast. My hand pulled at the serpent and pulled. In vain, I failed to pull the serpent out of his throat. Then there cried out of me, bite, bite, its head off, bite. So cried it out of me, my horror, my hatred, my loathing, my pity, all my good and my bad cried with one voice out of me, right? End quote. You hear the panic in Zarathustra's voice, the adrenaline, the terror. He says, bite. Skipping. The shepherd, however, bit as my cry had admonished him. He bit with a strong bite. Far away did he spit the head of the serpent and sprang up. No longer shepherd, no longer man, a transfigured being, a light-surrounded being that laughed. Never on earth laughed a man as he laughed. End quote. Zarathustra ends by saying, my longing for that laughter gnaweth at me. Thus spoke Zarathustra. And this image, this graphic, horrific image, brings to mind the image of Nietzsche puking his brains out for days on end. Black bile coming out of the mouth. And the torture, the absolute torture, and the panic, and the wanting to say, you're wanting to pull out the snake, and you can't pull it out. You want to stop the horror, to stop the torture. And Zarathustra's message is you have to bite through it. There's no way around this. There's no evading this. There's no escaping this. You have to bite through it. You have to go through it. There's no way around. There's only through. And when you get through it, if you survive, you will laugh like no man has laughed before. You will be transfigured. You will no longer be shepherd, no longer man. You become a transfigured being, a light-surrounded being. The central message of Nietzsche is you have to redeem your suffering. You have to go through the bad things. You have to endure and get to the other side of suffering. And when you do, Nietzsche says. When you finally get to the other side, if you survive, you'll be able to laugh and see that it was worth it. See that it belonged. See that the laughter redeems those quadrillion miles in the dark. Our modern world is all about distractions, being able to constantly turn on our phone or self-medicate with technology and other things. But Nietzsche's message is that this is a mistake. We have to go through things. One of Nietzsche's most famous quotes is, "What doesn't kill me makes me stronger." And now we understand what he means by that. And another famous, beloved quote of Nietzsche is, "If you gaze long into the abyss gazes back into you." End quote. And now we know what he means by that. Nietzsche's message is to gaze into that abyss, the abyss of despair, the abyss of being alone and sick and suffering. In different language, from a different perspective, it could be meditation, just sitting with your thoughts and with your mind and gazing into that abyss of the mind, of what is now, and not distracting yourself so that you are transformed in the process. The message of Nietzsche is don't avoid the void. That sense of emptiness, the sense of resistance, that sense of dissatisfaction, you sit with it and you get to the other side of it. And in doing so, you can digest it and you can redeem it. But if you don't do that, if you distract yourself, then you're living a thoroughly modern, decadent kind of life. You're in that abyss between the animal and the Superman. Another way of characterizing Nietzsche's insights, another way in which he articulates these insights, is in terms of a perspective shift. That the standard way of being a human being in the world is thinking in terms of your life, your free will, your decisions, your timeline of experience, and asking, is it good or bad? Am I there? Am I where I want to be? Am I not where I want to be? And Nietzsche, because of his life experiences, because of staring long into the abyss, because of being sharpened and hardened and purified by pain, has had a perspective shift. And he doesn't see from the same place that we see. And he tells us this in various places in his writing. And it's so hard to grasp. It's so hard to understand. And Nietzsche tells us this is hard to grasp and hard to understand. There's a sense that Nietzsche knows he's trying to communicate something which can't be heard, which can't be understood, because it's a shift that either happens or doesn't happen. Nietzsche has made the shift. Nietzsche is the Superman. And he knows that he's talking to people who can't understand this. So let's look at an aphorism in Twilight of the Idols, which again is something that I think is often just not understood, not appreciated, ignored. But I think this is so key to understanding Nietzsche. He's talking about pessimism. He's talking about the idea that life is not good, that life is not worth living. He says, how do we respond to these people who have a negative attitude towards life? Because they had a bad life, maybe. They suffered. They're not happy. What does Nietzsche say to them? Quote, "After all, judgments and valuations of life, whether for or against, cannot be true. Their only value lies in the fact that they are symptoms. They can be considered only as symptoms. Per se, such judgments are nonsense." Okay? This is Nietzsche's response. You think life is good, you think life is bad. Your judgments are nonsense, Nietzsche says. You must therefore endeavor by all means to reach out and try to grasp this astonishingly subtle axiom. Nietzsche knows this is subtle. Nietzsche knows you're going to struggle to grasp this. The value of life cannot be estimated. A living man cannot do so because he is a contending party, or rather the very object in the dispute and not a judge. End quote. Nietzsche rejects the perspective of a person who wants to judge life as either good or bad. You are a contending party, Nietzsche says. You are in no position to judge. Here's another characteristic quote by Nietzsche, again, articulating the same perspective shift. He's trying to give us a sense of how his perspective is different. Purified, hardened by pain and suffering. Quote, once upon a time, in some out-of-the-way corner of that universe, which is dispersed into numberless twinkling solar systems, there was a star upon which clever beasts invented knowing. That was the most arrogant and mendacious minute of world history. But nevertheless, it was only a minute. After nature had drawn a few breaths, the star cooled and congealed, and the clever beasts had to die. One might invent such a fable, and yet he still would not have adequately illustrated how miserable, how shadowy and transient, how aimless and arbitrary the human intellect looks within nature. There were eternities during which it did not exist, and when it is all over with the human intellect, nothing will have happened. End quote. Right? From another perspective, nothing will have happened. Nothing is happening. And the Superman is that very, very, very unique individual who's able to see that and make that shift. I want to end talking about some passages from Nietzsche's book, The Antichrist, where he talks about Jesus. It's well known, and it's hard to overstate how much disdain and resentment Nietzsche has towards religion, specifically towards Christianity, towards Judaism, towards Judeo-Christian morality. He hates these things. And it's hard to understand why. It's hard to understand the anger and the vehemence of these attacks. But I think it becomes easier to understand when you appreciate what I think so few people seem to appreciate who talk about Nietzsche and write about Nietzsche, is how much Nietzsche loved the character of Jesus, how much Nietzsche loved Jesus. A famous quote by Nietzsche is, "There is only one true Christian and he died on the cross." But that undersells. That is an understatement. And for Nietzsche, who loved Jesus so much, what Christianity did is so upsetting to him. The distortion of Jesus and his message and his person upsets Nietzsche in a way which is it makes him so angry. And again, because I think Nietzsche identifies with Jesus. He sees himself as Jesus. And I think a lot of what motivates Nietzsche is to sort of resurrect that message and that idea of Jesus while avoiding the danger and the disaster and the catastrophe that befell Jesus. Because in Nietzsche's mind, Jesus was turned into a self-help cult. He was turned into a self-help program, a denial of this world. And Nietzsche sees that as the ultimate distortion. And I think so much of what he's doing is trying to avoid that same fate for himself. So this is from The Antichrist. This is Nietzsche talking about Jesus. This saintly anarchist who called the lowest of the low, the outcasts and sinners, the Chandala of Judaism, to revolt against the established order of things, and in language which, if the Gospels are to be trusted, would get one sent to Siberia even today. This man was a political criminal, insofar as political criminals were possible. End quote. And so for Nietzsche, Jesus is a saintly anarchist, rebelling against these power structures, these hierarchies of religion. And what was Jesus' message? Quote, "What is the meaning of glad tidings? True life, eternal life has been found." This is Nietzsche's reading of Jesus. And this is also Nietzsche's philosophy, because this is Nietzsche's identification with Jesus. True life, eternal life has been found. It is not promised. It is actually here. It is in you. It is life in love. In love, free from all selection or exclusion, free from all distance. Everybody is the child of God. Jesus does not by any means claim anything for himself alone. As the child of God, everybody is equal to everybody else. Skipping, quote, "The glad tidings are simply that there are no longer any contradictions, that the kingdom of heaven is for the children. The faith which raises its voice here is not a faith that has been won by a struggle. It is to hand. It was there from the beginning. It is a sort of spiritual return to childishness. A faith of this sort does not show anger. It does not blame, neither does it defend itself. It does not bring the sword. It has no inkling of how it will one day establish feuds between man and man. It does not demonstrate itself either by miracles or by reward and promises, or yet through the scriptures. It is in itself, at every moment, its own miracle, its own reward, its own proof, its own kingdom of God." Right? This is Nietzsche describing amor fati. There's no proof, there's no miracles, there's no scripture. Every moment is its own miracle. Every moment is its own kingdom of God. This faith cannot be formulated. It lives, it guards against formulas. This is, I think, so key to Nietzsche's work, this guarding against formulas. It can't be formulated. Skipping ahead, with a little freedom in the use of words, Jesus might be called a free spirit. He cares not a jot for anything that is established. The word killeth. Everything fixed killeth, right? These are Jesus's messages. Everything fixed is detrimental. The idea, experience, life as he alone knows it, according to him, opposed to every kind of word, formula, law, faith, and dogma. He speaks only of the innermost things, life or truth or light, in his expression for the innermost thing. Everything else, the whole of reality, the whole of nature, language even, has only the value of a sign, of a simile for him. Skipping ahead a bit. The kingdom of heaven is a state of the heart, not something which exists beyond this earth or comes to you after death. The kingdom of God is not something that is expected. It has no yesterday, nor any day after tomorrow. It is not going to come in 1,000 years. It is an experience of the heart. It is everywhere. It is nowhere. This messenger of glad tidings died as he lived and as he taught, not in order to save mankind, but in order to show how one ought to live. It was a mode of life that he bequeathed to mankind, his behavior before his judges, his attitude towards his executioners, his accusers, and all kinds of calumny and scorn, his demeanor on the cross. He offers no resistance. He does not defend his rights. He takes no step to ward off the most extreme consequences. He does more. He provokes them, and he prays, suffers, and loves with those, in those who treat him ill. Not to defend oneself, not to show anger, not to hold anyone responsible, but to refrain from resisting even the evil one, to love him." End quote. And I think it's clear now why Nietzsche sees himself, calls himself the Antichrist, why Nietzsche saw himself as continuing this message, but trying to present it in a way that resisted the distortions of a self-help program, that resist the distortions of religion or metaphysical philosophy or morality or good and evil. Presented in a way that doesn't give you anything to hold on to. All he wants to do is sort of shake the bars of your cage, of model a different way, to tell you there's another way to live in this world. This modern world of distraction, of decadence, is not the end point. It's not living the way you were meant to live. And that's all he can say. And that's all he can give us, because to say any more would be to say too much.